out of fury. I'm not ready yet. I'm out of fury. I'm not ready yet. I'm out of fury.
What's going on, guys? Magdallan here. Today I want to offer you my review of Diablo 4 from the perspective of a semi-casual gamer. I played quite a bit the first 2 days that it came out in the early access, and then from that point on I've just played, I don't know, maybe 3 hours a day, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, but certainly not no-lifing it. I took my time going through the campaign. I wanted to experience the game in the way that I think a lot of people are going to, and I have seen quite a few videos in the last day or two that have the stats that indicate that about 50% of the players are still under level 50, and only about 10 or 15 or 20%, depending on which video I looked at, were above level 70. So I'm somewhere right in the middle. And so I thought that this would be a good time to share my thoughts on the experience, let you guys know what I liked, what I didn't like, and talk a little bit about the value proposition of the game and the longevity in the sense of, how long am I going to keep playing it, and what are my expectations for what the game's going to look like once we have season type content here in, I believe, about a month and a half or so. So I've broken it down into, I've got like 6 categories that I rated the game on, and then I'll, average it out for you at the end. And the first thing is the story. And I've seen lots of videos, and I mentioned this in a previous video of mine. I think it's really surprising that the default position, the almost no-brainer type position that people are taking, is that the story is good. And I just disagree. I think it's extremely mid. I don't think the characters are very compelling. I don't think there was almost anything surprising that happens in the entire course of the campaign from a storyline, from a narrative perspective. A lot of the major events that happen are kind of ham-fisted violence to one of the main characters, or just things that you kind of see coming from a mile away. And at the end of the campaign, I won't spoil any of the story, but I mean, essentially it just kind of peters out. It just didn't feel epic to me. The final boss fight is really underwhelming. And in fact, I would make the argument that in general, the boss design for the game is pretty poor. Again, it's not that there's not interesting mechanics or that there isn't diversity in bosses throughout the campaign. It's just that I didn't find myself excited. Even when you fight some characters that are, endemic to the Diablo franchise, some returning enemies, I thought that they just really didn't handle that well. And it just doesn't come off as very epic, doesn't come off as very exciting. And you're just kind of going through the motions a little bit. And that's kind of the way I felt about the entire storyline. Now, as far as the actual campaign experience, taking into account not just the story, but the pacing of the game, how fast you level, the integration of the quests, and the exploration of the map that is entailed in completing the campaign. For just the story, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. For the experience as a whole, of going from about level 1 to about 41, I think is when I completed the campaign, I'll give that an 8. It was a pretty cohesive experience. I enjoyed it. I don't know that I would want to do it again, but it was solid. It was definitely an experience that was entertaining and engaging. I found myself, at least for the first day or two, being excited to wake up and fire the game up. And I think that that was a good sign, at least initially. The different environments that you are going through as you are completing the campaign, I think, are varied enough that it kept things interesting. And despite the lack of narrative flair, there is a diversity of characters. There's always something going on, even if it's not the best storytelling that you'll ever encounter. And so, as a packaged experience, the first, I'm not sure if it took me 20 hours or 25 hours. I'm not sure exactly how long it took me to complete the campaign. But again, I think 8 out of 10. It was better than just average, but I don't think it was stellar. Now, in terms of the power fantasy of the character I was playing, in my case, it was a barbarian. This I'm going to give a lower score of a 6. And it could have been a 5. I really did not ever, even really for more than just a moment here or there, when you blow all your cooldowns and you take out a big pack of mobs. Other than that, you just don't feel powerful. The way that they scale the game is essentially like an anti-power fantasy. You constantly feel like you're trying to scrape by. And there are some things you can do to kind of get around that and outscale stuff a little bit with your gear and collecting the altars of Lilith throughout the world map. But generally speaking, as I leveled up, I either felt like I was getting weaker or I felt like I was basically barely hanging on to the power that I had achieved. And the skill tree, while it's not as bad as some people have pointed out, I don't think, it's also not very engaging. It's not very interesting. And once you've kind of decided the build that you want to go with, it's pretty well mapped out for you. There's not a huge amount of variance in terms of what you're going to pick, at least not at the beginning. I did find that towards the end of the campaign, I almost didn't know what to do with the points because it just didn't seem like they were going to really do much. The only time where I really felt like, my character just got more powerful, I can do something a little bit different, I can engage with the content a little bit more aggressively and have it not result in my character's death, were when I got a legendary item that had an affix on it that was specifically tailored to the skill I was using. In my case, most of the time it was Whirlwind. For about 10 or 15 levels, I played Hammer of the Ancients. And I think for just a little bit, I played another skill, but that was negligible. It was essentially just Whirlwind and Hammer of the Ancients. And it just didn't feel that good. It just felt kind of like, as I said, it felt like the world was just keeping right up with me, and it didn't really matter that much if I upgraded my gear, because I wasn't upgrading the gear to become more powerful against the enemies I was fighting. I was upgrading my gear as a matter of necessity to make sure that when I leveled up the next time, I didn't get a massive power decrease and feel like everything just got harder. Now, in terms of the items, I'm also going to give that a 6. I feel like the stats that are on the items are incredibly boring, and most of them, it seems like they tried to get away from some of the traditional type modifiers that you would have in an action RPG like Path of Exile or previous Diablo games. And the way that they seem to have approached that is to just kind of take additional damage and break that into 5 or 6 or however many it is, different variants of that. But that seems to come at the expense of having any modifiers on the items that you actually feel when you put the item onto your character. There wasn't, to my knowledge, there's not like attack speed or something like that where you put the item on and you can immediately tell that something is different. I don't think, again, aside from the few times where I got a legendary that had a specific affix that affected Whirlwind, I don't remember a single time where I put on a single item and it altered my gameplay experience at all. And that seems to me to be fairly outside of what you would think would be the goals of itemization for this type of game, for an action RPG game. And so I found that the items were not exciting. When things were dropping, I was mostly just mousing over them looking for green text, and if there was green, I put it on. If it made my attack power stat on the character screen go up, then I wore it, and if it didn't, then I broke it down or sold it to a vendor. And yeah, boring and uninspired. And then as far as the end game, so after I hit level 41 and completed the campaign, I ran a bunch of dungeons. There are a few of them that I've seen in a lot of YouTube videos. I believe it's called Champion's Demise or something like that is the main one that I farmed. And it's kind of cool. You run in, it's got multiple lanes, and you just run and aggro a bunch of packs and then, whirlwind through them and kill them off. And the experience was fairly good. It was relatively quick to level up, and that was okay. The problem is the things that you're going to have to do, or that I feel like I have to do to really get into the end game, are things that I'm just straight up not going to do. It's not an issue for me of how good or bad is it. It's just it's a hard no for me. I'm not collecting all those altars of Lilith. I'm just not going to do that. Maybe it's not a big deal for most players, so if that's the case, by all means, ignore this part of my opinion, but I'm not running around and collecting all of those. I have no interest in going and doing all the side quests and completing the renown for every zone. I'm not playing World of Warcraft for a reason. I don't want to spend hours and hours doing what are essentially achievement runs through all these zones and completing them. And then my understanding is if you don't fully complete a zone and you try and start another character, they start back at 0. But if you complete it all the way, then when you start your next character, you just already have those bonuses. And it's like, okay, I'm not. So not only am I not doing that, but I'm not making a second character because it's not going to happen for me. I thought that the concept initially was not too abrasive to me of these altars throughout the game that give you a small stat boost or an additional Paragon point or an additional amount to the orbs that you can carry or ovals. I wasn't turned off to it initially, but in practice, it's like, no, I'm gonna have to look up a bunch of videos and maps and find out where all these statues are, and then run around trying to find them. And I'm just not gonna do it. And that, to my understanding, having all those statues, all those extra Paragon points, those are going to be pretty essential for maximizing your character. And so if that's something that you are interested in doing, be aware that you're going to have to go through that slog. And I wish you luck if you're willing to do that, but I am not. And so the end game for me gets a 5. Now, as a caveat, once I got to World Tier 3, there opened up these Helltide events. In fact, I think there might be one. Yeah, there's one going on right now. And when you hover over it, it's got like a timer on it. And these are dope. This is the best thing in the game, in my opinion. You run into these zones. There's mobs everywhere. They're very challenging, but people are there doing it. And so you can just run in, find a bunch of people, and you just run around. There's always going to be a couple big boys in there that have their characters much more powerful. And you just kind of follow them around and shit on everything. I had actually a lot of fun just running around and enjoying these. You get to see how other people have set up their characters. There's a lot of people running around. As I said, the mob density is really way more than any other open world areas in the game that I've seen. I also very much enjoyed the Legion events when those would spawn. Again, it's the same type of deal where you kind of run to them and there's already people there doing it. And I just thought that was very enjoyable. But that's not going to be the whole end game. You're going to have to slog through dungeons. And that is another thing that drags the end game for me down to a 5. The dungeons are fucking boring, dude. I'm really surprised that they got into the game the way that they are, because again, maybe some people are just going to smash these out, but they do not have like the PoE style, like I'm going to sit down and blast these. Like they're an absolute chore. And I don't know what, the preponderance of the numbers are. I'm not sure how many of them have this, but often you'll get into one and it'll just tell you have to kill all the monsters in this area. And it's like, oh, come on, man. I don't want to run around looking for every single little red dot on the map and fight all of these mobs. My cooldowns aren't up, so I'm sitting there having to use my auto attack thing or whatever it's called, your builder. In my case, lunging strike. It does no damage. And then in those cases, you really feel the problematic choice that they made of forcing you into the spender and generator, back and forth type gameplay. I think Asmongold called it the feast or famine. gameplay style. And oh man, when you get into a dungeon and it tells you kill all the mobs in this area, you're just in for a rough ride, man. And again, maybe if you've got dozens and dozens more hours to play the game than I do, or you're planning on sticking around indefinitely, then maybe this isn't as big an issue for you, because eventually you're going to outgear the stuff and it's not going to be a problem. But for me, the dungeons were, I dreaded having to do them. As I said, I did farm that one dungeon to get from, I don't know, 41 to like 47, 48, with, interspersed with these Helltide events and the Legion events that pop up. But the idea of like having to go and farm dungeons, or I've only gotten one of them so far, but it looks like you can't really choose which dungeon you're doing. And so I'm not sure if you can just farm the same dungeon over and over with this sigil system. But if you can't, then it's like, oh no, I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in that. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm not just going to sit here and bitch about the dungeon system and the parts of the end game that I don't like. But it was not very inspiring to me. If you're somebody that is coming from Path of Exile and you like the chill blasting map type atmosphere that game has, I didn't feel any of that personally when I started to get towards the end game, when I completed the campaign and started working towards just gearing the character out and trying to get into, World Tier 3 and then whatever. I didn't feel any of that. A lot of the stuff just kind of feels like a chore. And ultimately I'll leave it at that. And then the last category that I'll mention is the art style of the game. I mean, I think the character models look pretty cool. I like that you can go to the wardrobe thing and customize your character out. That's pretty cool. But the color palette that they chose for the majority of the game is pretty samey. And though there's a lot of detail on the screen at any given time, again, it just doesn't seem very inspired in terms of the way that it was designed. And I assume that has to do with that there were complaints about the art style from Diablo 3. And so they chose to use more earth tones, less vibrant colors. And the result of that, I think, is that after, I got through the first couple zones, it just kind of felt like a lot of it was the same. And there's some variance in the monsters that you encounter, and there's some variance in the way that the terrain is organized. Some zones seem like they have more of the interactable, verticality elements. And, some of the zones are, obviously you've got snow or you've got sand or whatever, but there wasn't a whole lot that was super memorable to me about the different zones. And so I'm hoping that when they do seasons, or even looking forward to like an expansion, that maybe they will play a little bit more loose with the art style when they add new zones to the game. Because again, I feel like the zones were just a little bit meh for me. And so anyway, for art, I'm going to give it a 7. And so adding all those up, if you take the average, that means I'm giving the game like a 6.5 out of 10. And so it's not terrible. I had a good time. I'm probably still going to play a little bit longer. I don't want to burn out on the game before the first season comes out. And so I would say I'm, at level 51, getting into World Tier 3. I think I'd like to maybe push it to level 70 and taste a little bit of World Tier 4, but that may or may not happen. I'd say I'm 80%. If there was a bar that filled up as my gameplay was going on, that when it hit 100, I was going to move on from the game, I'd say I've got that bar 80% full. I did what I wanted to do. I've kind of experienced the game for what it is. I gave it a fair shake, as it were, completed the campaign, tasted the end game a little bit, and that's where I'm at. I would say if I had to put a number of hours on it, I'd say I'll probably play another like 15 hours, maybe 20 hours. So maybe 3 or 4 more days, 5 days, something like that. Maybe give it another week of play. And so that would mean that I got, roughly 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, of a couple days of playing it a lot. And then, as I said, after that, playing maybe 3 to 4 hours a day, give or take. And yeah, I guess ultimately that is about all I've got for you guys today. If you enjoyed anything that was in the video, if any of it was interesting to you, please do give me a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. I appreciate you.